The MPN Research Foundation has had a terrific impact on the disease and research. We've given about $20 million to about 91 researchers over the lifetime of the foundation.
We are a small but mighty foundation. We're looking to the entire MPN community to look at the research that we're doing and recognize that there's so much more work to be done. We need the support to be able to make it happen.
Investment drives innovation and progress, and ultimately a cure for every single one of us.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Kapila Viges, Chief Executive Officer of the MPN Research Foundation. I'm glad you could join us today to hear how we are pushing research forward and learn more about the MPN Progression Registry. MPN Research Foundation has a singular focus. We fund original research all around the world in pursuit of new treatments, and ultimately one day cures for essential thrombocythemia, known as ET, polycythemia vera, known as PV, and myelofibrosis, known as MF. And together, these blood cancers are collectively referred to as MPNs, or myeloproliferative neoplasms. We are co-hosting today's event with Sobi, a global biopharmaceutical company transforming the lives of patients with rare and debilitating diseases, including MPNs. We are honored to have Sobi as a longstanding partner of the foundation and the first visionary supporter of our MPN Progression Registry. Our discussion today will allow us to dive into the complexities of MPN disease progression from a medical perspective. We'll spend some time discussing the value of a patient registry in research and drug development and how it can improve outcomes for patients. And we'll learn more about Sobi and their commitment to the MPN community. So let's get started. I'm pleased to introduce the two distinguished physicians on our panel today. First, Dr. Jamie Freedman is the Chief Medical Officer for Sobi North America. Dr. Freedman is a board-certified internal medicine specialist, hematologist, and medical oncologist. He has held several senior leadership positions at major pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Raajit Rampal has been medical advisor to the MPN Research Foundation for several years now. He is a hematologist-oncologist at Memorial Sloan Kettering who specializes in treating myeloproliferative neoplasms and leukemias. And Dr. Rampal also serves as the principal investigator of the MPN Progression Registry. Drs. Rampal and Freedman, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Great. So Dr. Rampal, let's start with what it is about MPNs that make it a more complicated disease journey for patients.
Yeah, I think, it's an important question because there's a lot of different things that can happen during the course of the disease, right? And I think that's what makes it a challenge. We know that, ET and PV patients, we worry that they have a risk of clotting. That's the principal problem that we face. But the disease can progress into myelofibrosis. It can progress into acute leukemia. Patients can have a high symptom burden. So there is sort of a multifaceted set of problems that we deal with, when we think about patients with ET or PV. Yeah. Same is true with patients with myelofibrosis, where a number of things can happen from a symptom standpoint to bone marrow failure to progression to leukemia. So we always have to think about our patients in a kind of a spectrum in terms of what we have to worry about.
And when you talk specifically about disease progression, is there a particular way we characterize progression? Is there a way we can measure it or help us define it a little bit better?
Yeah, I think there's obvious and not so obvious, right? I think obvious is when we have a patient with ET or PV who progresses to the next stage of the disease, like myelofibrosis. This is a very clear-cut thing for which there are diagnostic criteria that have to be met. And so that is sort of the obvious thing. What isn't as obvious and what we certainly need to learn more about is, are there other forms of progression? Is there a genomic progression that occurs? And maybe that's a harbinger of things to come. Is there, a symptomatic progression? there are, I think, a lot of other categories of progression that we need to understand, because we see things happen and change during a patient's clinical course, but we need to be able to put that together, with data behind it to understand what are those other types of progression. But clearly, overt progression to myelofibrosis or to leukemia are key things that we worry about, for which there are definitions currently, but more needs to be learned.
Right. That's helpful thinking at it from a treater's perspective. So, Dr. Freedman, considering your role as Chief Medical Officer at Sobi, why is studying progression important to a drug company, and specifically to your myelofibrosis program?
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. Thanks for having me on this panel. So we have a drug at Sobi for myelofibrosis that's both primary myelofibrosis, but also for patients who have secondary myelofibrosis from polycythemia vera and essential thrombocythemia. And it's a JAK2 inhibitor, and there's a few JAK inhibitors in the same class. This happens to be a JAK2 selective inhibitor, so it doesn't inhibit JAK1 like some of the other JAK inhibitors on the market. And we are currently FDA approved for treating patients with advanced myelofibrosis where the platelet count is less than 50,000. So understanding progression for us is actually quite critical, because when patients do progress and they have more advanced disease, that's when pacritinib, our product, also known as Vonjo, would be used. Now, there is data that it is also effective in patients with higher platelet counts in earlier disease. But understanding that whole progression sequence is very important to when to use our drug. And the fact that it's less myelosuppressive than some of the other JAK inhibitors, because it's JAK2 selective, allows us to maintain a dose of the drug even in patients with most advanced disease. So that's why progression is so important for us to understand.
So thank you for sharing that with us. So it's very clear that it is an important area for our industry leaders to study within their treatment programs. What challenges specifically does a company like Sobi or biopharmaceutical companies in general face when you are trying to better understand that patient journey and that disease progression journey? What are the challenges you face in trying to get at that?
Well, in general, we really want to be able to treat patients at the right time, and that's where the patient journey comes into play. So the earlier you can treat a disease, the more impact you can have on the outcome of the disease. Ultimately, if we could prevent these diseases, that would be ideal. But knowing that these patients do develop the diseases, we're looking for interventions at various points along the patient journey. I just talked about pacritinib, used for patients with relatively advanced disease. There are other new classes of drugs that are becoming available that are so-called disease modifying with the potential to reverse fibrosis. Most of them are all experimental at this stage in clinical trials, whether they're MDM2 inhibitors or BET inhibitors, and there's other classes as well. So the whole field is evolving, and I'm sure Dr. Rampal can tell you about that as well. There's a lot of active research investigation as to what is going to make a big difference on the impact of disease. And that's why understanding the patient journey is really so important to us.
Yeah. Dr. Rampal, do you want to follow up on that in terms of the new classes coming online?
Well, I think maybe to start with, I think one of the things that Jamie said is so important, which we know from all of cancer medicine, which is that if you treat earlier, you are likely to have better outcomes, right? If we wait for patients to get very sick, no matter how potent the medications are, I think our likelihood of success is lower. I think this is just sort of, biologically and clinically been our experience, over the last several decades, right? So it's a question of really two things. One is identifying the patients who are at highest risk of progressing or having a bad outcome. And number two, intervening with strategies and therapeutics that are likely to change that outcome. And that's the challenge, right? We have excellent drugs like, as right now, as we've talked about with JAK inhibitors, but, I think that their benefit may change if we were able to use them earlier, perhaps, or in combination with other drugs. Jamie talked about a couple of key drug classes, MDM2 inhibitors and MET inhibitors, which have been really well credentialed in the laboratory, and for which we know they have profound effects on the disease biology. But now we're seeing that happen clinically. Now we have good evidence for these drugs that have been in clinical trials that they are making an impact on how patients are doing. But the other question still remains, which is, what if you were to treat earlier? What if you knew that some set of patients are going to be fine? They're going to do okay with, for example, a JAK inhibitor, but you were able to say, we have another set of patients who aren't going to do as well. And maybe then we position more aggressive therapies, when we figure that out, right? I think that's where we need to go.
Yeah. So that sounds like that's a lot to process from even a patient's perspective, right? In terms of all of these new changes and evolutions in the treatment paradigm. So Dr. Rampal, how do you start to talk to your patients about this when you're thinking about, talking to them about their disease, their course of their disease?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting. It sort of happens usually the other way around, right? Which is that when we have a newly diagnosed patient, I try to always ask patients, what's your biggest concern? What's your biggest worry? Inevitably, lifespan, quality of life, and what's going to happen to me. That's the biggest question. That's often the elephant in the room, right? We talk about all of the other things about controlling blood counts and risk of thrombosis, but what people want to know is what's going to happen to me, right? And I think that is where we're limited. I think that right now, when we talk to patients about progression, we give them statistics that apply to a population, and that may or may not be really useful. If you think about talking to somebody who is diagnosed at age 75, how that information sits is very different than if you're talking to somebody who is diagnosed at age 38, right? Because the perspective on life is a very different thing in terms of numbers of years of life left and expectation for length of life and quality of life. But we apply the same statistic to both populations to say, well, this is what we think the risk of progression is. But we try to, impart on the patients that these are not numbers that apply to individuals, they apply to populations. So it isn't reassuring. It doesn't really help patients understand what their risk of progression, and it doesn't necessarily help us answer the primary question, which is, what is going to happen to me? And that's where we have kind of a major gap in how we help patients.
And so, Dr. Freedman, how does taking that sort of first line experience from the patient with their physician in terms of how they're talking about their disease journey, how do those insights inform for a drug company like Sobi, how you think about your development and drug programs?
Yeah, but so just to first follow up on some comments that Dr. Rampal said, the JAK inhibitors help with the symptoms of disease. They help shrink the spleen that is already overly enlarged with these diseases. There's these experimental therapies that may help, reverse some of the fibrosis, but then there are also patients who progress. And I think you mentioned earlier about genomic evolution. Some of these patients acquire, genetic mutations like XL1 and IDH1, EZH2 mutations that predict poor prognosis and then the development of leukemia. In which case other therapies are needed beyond the ones that we've already talked about. And I was just curious, Dr. Rampal, if you use those genetic mutations to predict progression and what therapies patients should go on next.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question. And I think this is also an evolving area, right? We use these mutations and, there are risk calculators for which they can be utilized in, and they give us a relative risk of progression, right? Or let's say leukemic transformation as an example, right? Somebody has, an IDH mutation, at least the data currently would suggest that they have a relatively higher risk of leukemic progression. The question then is, what do you do about that, right? Is that something you act on? Do you say to the patient, I think we should transplant you now or institute a therapy? And I think that's something we're still trying to figure out, but you have to live in the real world, right? And so when we are faced with this situation, oftentimes, if we think the risk is high enough, we're going to talk to the patient about earlier intervention. We're going to talk about earlier, referral to transplant. Even in that setting, though, I think that there is a lot more, that we need to learn, because a lot of the work that went into the genomics, as you've described, is from sort of limited genomic analyses, and I think we need to be a little bit more expansive in how we think about those things. But those are sort of future aims. And as I said, we've got to live in the real world now, which means that we have to essentially make our best guess on the information we have. And we emphasize to patients always that all of these things, right, the genomics or any other variable, they are not predictive, they're prognostic. And I think that's a hard thing to try to relate to somebody, right? To say that, yes, we're worried, but it may not happen. It doesn't predict that something bad's going to happen. And that's a very difficult thing to try to convey to a patient.
Yeah, thank you. And just to follow up, Kapila, on your specific question, hearing what Dr. Rampal just said, I think the real world evidence that is particularly that would come out of the registry that you have will be really informative to see the whole, patient journey, the longitudinal outcomes of these patients, because we don't actually know how to predict, what the next phase is going to be, or when patients develop leukemia. And I think this database could become very informative for that reason. And it would be very informative, not just to us as a company, but to many companies trying to really tackle myelofibrosis and other myeloproliferative disorders and really have an impact on changing the whole course trajectory of the disease. And it really takes real world data to be able to generate enough evidence, in a population basis to understand that.
Yeah, no, thank you for that, Dr. Freedman. I think that that really underscores where we're trying to head with this, the MPN Progression Registry. So following up on that, and those real world evidence data types and data sets, are there specific data insights that would be particularly useful in driving outcomes for patients in the near term?
Yeah, and just to clarify for people, most of the work that we've done with our drug products are in the context of clinical trials, which are in some ways much more stringent and restricted in compared to the real world, because we have various eligibility criteria, and we want to get the patients who we think we can follow the best to determine whether a drug is working, what the risk benefit of the drug is, but ultimately going into the real world population, which is the population that, prescribers like Dr. Rampal will treat, will give us a better idea of how effective and what the benefits and the risks and the safety issues are of those drugs. So in terms of the real world evidence, I think that it's really provides a wealth of information around the heterogeneity of disease. We just talked about genetic mutations. How patients do with various genetic mutations would be great to understand. Which ones progress faster or slower, which drugs that they should go on. There's the whole component around health equity. A lot of times our clinical trials don't give us a very diverse population, and we tend to go to the same large academic medical centers to do our clinical trials rather than out in the community, where there's a much more diverse population related to economic differences and racial differences. And I think we have to have a better understanding of that. That's where the real world evidence comes into play. And then I think that there's important data that we can collect that we don't normally collect in clinical trials around, the cost effectiveness of the drug. So that could be hospitalizations associated with the disease, the cost of care, the productivity of the patients, and even, getting more information on transfusion dependence, how often patients are transfused. All that information can be collected, and that is important from a payer perspective, providing it to insurance companies to convince them about the benefits of the drug, why treating patients actually is an economic advantage as on a population level. And that all can come out of real world data that doesn't come from the clinical trials itself.
Right. That's incredibly comprehensive sort of overview of the landscape, Dr. Freedman. So thank you for that. You're just really characterizing that real world evidence that can be useful in all sorts of arenas. So Dr. Rampal, with that context of that type of data, what could you do in research with your research colleagues with that level of real world evidence as you think about future research in MPNs?
Well, the two comments, right? One is, I think Jamie's comment about real world is extremely important. Most patients in the US with MPN are cared for in the community. They're not cared for in academic centers. And there is what we call an academic center referral bias, meaning that we get referred patients who are potentially the sickest, or, they fit the criteria for clinical trials, but that's not most patients. And so we really need to understand who is being treated and how they're being treated. Both of those things are essential pieces of information. Now, one of the things that I think is interesting here has to do with timing. And as we're kind of launching this and moving forward, we are sort of at the edge of the AI revolution. Now, AI gets thrown out, a term that kind of gets thrown out a lot, but AI is synonymous with machine learning. And really the fundamental thing with AI and machine learning that it can do is that it can take a set of data, large sets of data, and identify patterns that are not obvious to humans, that in ways, because we just can't put all of these variables together and necessarily form models. But that's what AI is built to do, is to form models. And so as we get a large amount of information and we learn things about how patients are cared for in the community, what their journey is like, those are by themselves important pieces of information, right? Because it's going to tell us about the patients in the real world, and it will apply to the majority of patients with MPN, not patients just treated at specialized centers. But we would also be in a position to interrogate it in multidimensional ways, things that we can't really necessarily think about right now, but that when you put it into a large sort of a machine learning platform or something similar, that would allow you to identify patterns that may not be obvious to anybody who's taking care of these patients.
Yeah, that's an incredible look into the future of the potential that this data could bring in really truly transforming the disease landscape. Maybe shifting gears to one other angle of what this data or evidence could potentially produce for us is the topic of the endpoints that we're currently measuring with our current drug programs with the regulatory authorities. And so maybe first Dr. Rampal and then Dr. Freedman, you can add to it in terms of how we might be able to leverage this type of data to further inform the clinical outcomes or the clinical endpoints that we might want to see in future drug programs.
Yeah, this is fundamentally important, right? Because how drugs get approved is vital, because we can come up with ideas, we can come up with scientifically based therapies that make biological sense and clinical sense, but unless they can get through the regulators, they won't do anything for anybody. That means that we have to come at the question about what are the important endpoints from the perspective of identifying endpoints that actually matter to patients, right? We have current endpoints for MF and for PV and ET, and we can debate whether or not those are really the most meaningful thing. And we would probably need another hour and a half to get through all of that discussion. But I think we are in a position to start to ask the question, do the endpoints we have currently make any sense? Is this really the most important thing? But in order to answer that question, we have to answer what is important, right? You have to answer both questions. And that is really where a registry can help us to understand what are the real problems here and what are we actually trying to solve for. If we know that, and we can show that this is important to patients' outcomes, or to their well-being in general, or to their symptoms, whatever it is, then we can build new endpoints that will result in studies that are designed to ultimately answer questions that are of most impact to patients, and not simply regulatory hurdles. They should be as synergistic as possible, the endpoints of studies and what the regulators want to see.
And Dr. Freeman, how might that be viewed from an industry perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with everything Dr. Rampal has said. There are these standard endpoints that are used in clinical trials. Obviously, symptom improvement is of a benefit to patients, but I think knowing what the survival advantage that you would have from a drug, like measuring overall survival, would be an endpoint. I think that would be important. It's obviously a very long endpoint, and you have to wait a long time to get the results of that. But having that would be ultimately very clinically meaningful. we talked earlier about patients going to transplant, having successful transplantation after being treated would be another success endpoint. I'd be curious what Dr. Rampal thinks about that. There are some more experimental endpoints around, we talked about, for example, if you have myelofibrosis, measuring reversal of myelofibrosis, you can do biopsies, and, there are also imaging techniques that are used, whether it's quantitative MRI or PET scanning, but I don't know how useful that would be as an endpoint, but it is something that's being done. So just curious from Dr. Rampal, what he thinks about some of those different endpoints.
I think these are great ideas, right? I mean, I think these are things we've got to look at, and I think the what we want to see with anything, like any type of a biomarker, is that it correlates with something clinically, well, ultimately with multiple things clinically, right? So, looking at bone marrow fibrosis and maybe changes in genomic structure, that's really important. To your point about getting people to transplant, this is not an outcome that is measured in trials, but it's important because at the moment that is the only curative therapy that we have. And so could that be potentially a way to think about drugs that have a meaningful impact, i.e. they get patients positioned for transplant? This is a reasonable idea, right? But I think what we're all saying is that we need to have data in order to change the current paradigm. And I think that is ultimately what the big value is about what we're trying to embark upon here.
Great. Thank you both for this really insightful discussion as to how we might be able to answer a lot of these really key and important questions for impacting patients with data, with real world evidence, because I think we all understand the scientific value that data at a disease registry can have in advancing research, in developing better drug programs, and ultimately, as we all seek, improving patient outcomes. And so a registry that includes the types of data elements that you both highlighted today, it's an ambitious, but it's a highly worthy investment in research for a disease foundation like ours to make. Dr. Freedman and Dr. Rampal today have really shed light on the importance of why we want to be studying disease progression, and particularly in this complex family of essential thrombocythemia, polycythemia vera, and myelofibrosis. We want to be able to study it before it starts to progress and see signs of secondary AML. This is a conversation that we've been listening to for some time at MPN Research Foundation. Our patient community, where everything starts for us, has been consistent and clear in their message to us, understanding the risk and having proactive options for treating progression is a constant worry for patients and their caregivers. We reported this first a few years back in our Voice of the Patient report, and then most recently in our MPN Community Unmet Needs Survey, where over 80% of patients and caregivers reported that slowing progression was their primary treatment goal. We've also worked very closely with Dr. Rampal and his research colleagues who lead our Progression Research Network to explore how we as MPN Research Foundation could be a catalyst in overcoming some of the challenges to research and answering these key questions about disease progression so that we can really have that impact on patients' lives as the doctors highlighted for us today. Clearly, we need more robust evidence, meaning we need more data about many more patients over much longer periods of time. Data that will look back at the history or the course of the disease and start to uncover some of these clinical factors that the doctors highlighted today, or the biomarkers that appeared before a patient progressed, so that we can then prospectively test or follow into the future those clinical factors to validate whether those things actually led to progressive disease. And very importantly, as Dr. Freeman highlighted earlier, is we want to follow that and understand specifically in which patients those biomarkers and clinical factors led to progressive disease. And we want to be able to demonstrate that as a disease foundation so that we can partner with industry leaders like Sobi and others in the MPN landscape to develop drugs to target these markers of progression with treatments that have more meaningful benefit to patient, as Dr. Rampal had outlined for us today. These treatments, new treatments that might slow, stop, or reverse disease progression. That's how we change lives. But first, we need to better understand what is truly driving progression, as Dr. Rampal said. So today, we're excited to share that the MPN Progression Registry will launch this fall based on a lot of valuable input from our patients, from our physicians, their biopharmaceutical industry leaders, and the health information experts and data scientists, we've developed a roadmap that will allow us to pursue this long-term effort, really to study disease progression in the long run while gathering early insights into the patient journey across all MPN indications, as Dr. Freedman said would be helpful. So to be clear, this is a registry for ET, PV, and MM patients comprehensively. We know that these markers of progression are complex and they will take time, perhaps years, to study and capture. But we have to start somewhere, and we at MPN Research Foundation have been called to action to start now. We are conveners of the MPN community, and we will play our part. We'll build the infrastructure and begin gathering data to inform ongoing drug development, like the pacritinib story that Dr. Freedman shared with us, and then also shed light on standards of care today as we see differences between the community settings and academic settings. But at the same time, we will pragmatically be able to expand our research capability to collect and validate markers of disease progression over longer periods of time. You can download a white paper on our website to read more about our path forward and how you can get involved as a patient, as a clinician, or as a drug developer as we prepare to open for enrollment for patients later this fall. I want to truly thank Dr. Rampal and Dr. Freedman for highlighting the importance of studying disease progression more broadly across all our MPNs. They both underscored for us today also the incredible impact that data and longitudinal registry can really have on research and improving patients' lives. We are very grateful to Sobi, our first visionary sponsor of the MPN Progression Registry. We're grateful for your partnership and your generosity, and we invite our other industry partners to join us on this journey. Thank you all for listening today. The video of this recording will also be available on our LinkedIn page later and our YouTube channel within a few days. Thank you to those of you who put comments and questions into the chat. Somebody from our staff will also follow up with you in a few days. And you can also use the QR code to join the MPN Research Foundation community. This will allow you to stay up to date on the latest in MPN research, and very importantly, be the first to receive MPN Progression Registry launch announcements later this fall. Our mission is only meaningful with your support and engagement from all our stakeholders, the drug makers, the doctors, and the patients. Thank you all for stepping up and being part of the solution.